I still think about this every time someone knocks on my door unexpectedly. At the time, I was working remotely from my apartment. My desk was set up in the corner of my living room, and like every other weekday, I spent hours there staring at my computer. My apartment building was fairly new in a nice neighborhood, and I had always felt completely safe living there. That feeling disappeared in a single afternoon. It was around 1 o'clock when I heard someone knock on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but random visits weren't exactly unheard of in a large apartment complex. Before opening it, I looked through the peephole. 2 men were standing outside. They were both wearing maintenance uniforms. One carried a toolbox while the other was holding what looked like an air filter. Nothing about them seemed suspicious. When I opened the door, one of them politely explained that they were replacing the building's air filters and that they'd only need a minute. I couldn't remember the last time mine had been changed. I also didn't remember getting an email about it, but honestly, I didn't think much of it. Everything about them seemed normal, so I stepped aside and let them in. They walked straight toward my bedroom, where the air filter access panel was located inside a small closet. They thanked me and told me they'd be done in no time. I went back to my desk and continued working. For about a minute, I heard them moving around in the bedroom. Then I heard my apartment door open and close. Assuming they had both left, I stayed focused on work. A minute later, I got up, locked the front door, and sat back down. The rest of my workday passed without anything unusual happening. Around 5 o'clock, I finished work and decided to stay home for the evening. I cleaned up a little, unloaded the dishwasher, and eventually grabbed the trash to take it down the hallway to the garbage chute. The entire trip couldn't have taken more than a minute. When I walked back into my apartment, someone was standing in my living room, a man I'd never seen before. The moment we made eye contact, every instinct told me to get out. I backed into the hallway so fast that I actually stopped to check the apartment number, convinced I had somehow walked into the wrong unit. I hadn't. It was my apartment. For reasons I still can't explain, I stepped back inside. The man was gone from the living room, but I heard him sprint into another room. That was enough. I turned around, ran to the lobby, and called the police. They arrived within minutes and searched every room. Whoever had been inside was gone. After speaking with the officers and the building management, everything suddenly made sense. There had never been any scheduled maintenance that day. No one had been sent to replace air filters. Those 2 men weren't maintenance workers at all. Their entire visit had been a setup. While I thought both of them had left, only one actually walked out the front door. The other had hidden inside the small closet where the air filter was located. He stayed there for hours. Waiting, he expected me to leave eventually. When I stepped out to throw away the trash, he probably assumed I was leaving for the evening. That was his chance to search the apartment and steal whatever he could. The only problem for him was that I came back almost immediately. I walked in before he had the chance to do anything. He panicked, escaped before the police arrived, and left empty-handed. About a week later, I got an update from the police. They had arrested both men. It turned out they had been pulling the same scam at apartment complexes across the area. They posed as maintenance workers, gained access to people's homes, and had one person secretly stay behind until the resident left. I've replayed that day in my head countless times. If I had decided to grab dinner instead of taking out the trash, if I had stayed away for just another 15 or 20 minutes, I have no idea what I would have come home to. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. I've always considered myself a cautious person, but after what happened that night, I became a lot more careful about answering my front door. A couple of years ago, I was renting a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't isolated by any means. There were plenty of homes nearby, but the area had always felt peaceful. I never had a reason to feel unsafe. One evening, I got home later than usual after a long day at work. It was somewhere around 9 o'clock by the time I changed into comfortable clothes and started making dinner. Cooking has always been a way for me to unwind, so I had some music playing quietly while I worked in the kitchen at the back of the house. Then someone knocked on the front door. I checked the time. It was late enough that I wasn't expecting visitors, which immediately made me uneasy. I turned off the stove, walked to the front of the house, and looked through the window beside the door before opening it. A man was standing on my porch. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his head. The weather was warm, so the hood looked completely out of place. I couldn't make out much of his face, but something about the way he stood there gave me a bad feeling. He wasn't knocking frantically or calling out. He was just waiting. Every instinct told me not to open the door, so I quietly turned around and headed back toward the kitchen. Before I even made it halfway down the hallway, the doorbell rang. The timing was strange. It almost felt like he'd seen me walk away. I ignored it. A few minutes later, he knocked again. Still, I refused to answer. Eventually, everything went quiet. After waiting several minutes, I looked outside once more. The porch was empty. His car wasn't there. The street was completely silent. I let out a breath and convinced myself I had probably overreacted. Maybe he had the wrong address. Maybe he was looking for someone else. I went back to cooking. 5 minutes later, I nearly dropped the pan in my hands. Someone walked past the kitchen window. My backyard was fenced in, so there was absolutely no reason for anyone to be there. Then he stepped closer. It was the same man. He stopped directly outside the window, looked straight at me, and knocked on the glass. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't think, I just ran. I grabbed my phone in the living room, ready to call the police, but after a few moments of complete silence, I carefully worked up the courage to look outside again. He had disappeared. I checked every window in the house. Nothing. No movement. No footsteps. No sign that anyone had been there. I debated calling the police, but talked myself out of it. He hadn't actually tried to break in. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. I wish that had been the end of it. Later that night, I finally went to bed. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I woke up for no reason. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I noticed movement outside my bedroom window. Someone was walking across my backyard. I slowly got out of bed and looked through the curtains. My stomach dropped. It was him. He was back. He was walking toward the kitchen window again, exactly like before. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The dispatcher told me officers were already on their way while I stayed as far away from the back of the house as possible. I wasn't about to confront whoever this guy was. Within just a couple of minutes, police cars pulled up outside. Officers searched the yard and found the man before he could leave. I expected them to arrest him immediately. Instead, things became frustratingly complicated. He claimed he was lost. According to him, he thought a friend lived at my address and had simply made a mistake. Technically, he hadn't broken into the house. He hadn't damaged anything. Aside from trespassing, there wasn't enough evidence to prove what he intended to do. The officers warned him to stay away from my property and eventually let him leave. I watched him walk away from my yard that night, still feeling like none of his story made any sense. If he truly thought he had the wrong address, why did he come back hours later? Why walk into my fenced backyard? Why knock on my kitchen window after I'd already ignored him at the front door? I never got those answers. Thankfully, I never saw him again, but every now and then, when someone knocks on my door late at night, I still check every single window before I even think about answering. Looking back, I still can't believe how close I came to coming face to face with whoever walked into my house that night. I was 14 years old, and like most kids my age, I loved the rare evenings when I had the house all to myself. My parents trusted me enough to stay home alone after school, and this particular Friday was even better than usual. Both of them had plans after work and wouldn't be home until around 10. Before leaving that morning, one of them handed me some cash and told me to order pizza for dinner if I wanted. To a 14-year-old, that sounded like the perfect night. As soon as I got home from school, I threw my backpack in my room, turned on my PlayStation, and settled in for hours of gaming. Eventually, I ordered a pizza, and around 7 that evening the delivery driver arrived. I grabbed the food, paid him, thanked him, and rushed back upstairs before the pizza could even cool off. I don't remember closing the door. That's the part that still bothers me. I remember shutting it, but I honestly don't remember locking it. About an hour later, while I was halfway through another game, I heard something that immediately pulled my attention away from the screen. The front door opened. At first I smiled, assuming my parents had gotten home early. Then reality hit me. They weren't supposed to be back for another couple of hours. Even stranger. I never heard a key. The door had simply opened. I muted my game and listened. Someone was walking through the house. The footsteps were slow, careful, not the relaxed pace of someone who lived there. I sat perfectly still, trying to convince myself it had to be one of my parents. Maybe they forgot to text me. Maybe I just didn't hear the key. But deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. Then I remembered the pizza. My stomach dropped. I couldn't remember locking the front door after the delivery driver left. The footsteps moved across the first floor, then toward the staircase. I thought about yelling downstairs. "What are you doing? Who's there?" Anything, but the words never came out. Instead, I just listened as whoever it was began climbing the stairs, one step at a time. My bedroom was the second door on the left. The door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open just enough for someone in the hallway to look inside. I considered getting up to shut it. Too late. The sound of the hinges would give away exactly where I was. Besides, the door didn't even have a lock. There was nowhere to hide. The lights in my room were off because I liked gaming in the dark, which suddenly felt like the only thing working in my favor. I stayed frozen in my chair. Every step sounded louder than the last. The footsteps reached the top of the staircase. They entered the hallway, closer, closer. Finally, they stopped. For one terrifying second, I saw part of a figure through the narrow opening in my bedroom door. I looked away instinctively. I was convinced the door was about to swing open. I kept waiting, nothing. Instead, the footsteps started moving again, past my room, then back toward the staircase. I couldn't believe it. Whoever had entered my house was leaving. I listened until I heard the front door open, then close. Only after everything was silent did I finally move. I ran downstairs as fast as I could and locked the front door. Then I checked every window in the house. Nothing. The street outside looked completely normal. No parked car, no stranger walking away, no clue who had just been inside my home. I called my parents immediately. They rushed home, but by then whoever it was had disappeared. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been moved. It was as if they had simply walked inside, looked around, and left. To this day, I have no idea who that person was. Maybe they noticed the unlocked door and decided to see if anyone was home. Maybe they had planned to rob the place. Or maybe they realized someone was upstairs before they reached my room. I'll never know. What I do know is this. From that night forward, I never closed a door without checking the lock twice, because sometimes, all it takes is one small mistake to invite the wrong person inside. There are certain sounds you never forget. For me, it was the sound of something falling over in the next room. At the time, I lived alone in a third-floor apartment. It wasn't very big, just 2 bedrooms, but it was more than enough for one person. My former roommate had moved out a few months earlier, and I had turned the spare bedroom into a small office where I kept my computer, old boxes, and anything else that didn't have a proper place. I was an ordinary Tuesday night. I'd gone to work, stopped by the gym afterward, grabbed dinner on the way home, and spent the rest of the evening relaxing on the couch with a movie. Nothing unusual had happened. Around 11 o'clock, just as the movie was reaching its climax, I heard a loud crash. It came from the spare bedroom. It wasn't a tiny noise that could be explained away by the building settling. It sounded like several objects had fallen onto the floor. I muted the TV and listened. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. I sat there for another minute, trying to convince myself that one of the storage boxes had tipped over. The closet in that room was packed with old junk, so it wasn't impossible. Still, something about the sound didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The movie was still playing, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. Every few seconds I found myself looking toward the hallway. Eventually, I realized there was no way I was going to sleep without checking. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly walked toward the office. The hallway felt unusually quiet. I switched on the hallway light first, then the office light. Everything looked completely normal. The desk was exactly where I'd left it. The chair hadn't moved. Nothing appeared out of place. I actually laughed at myself. I figured I'd scared myself over nothing. Then I noticed the closet door. It was completely shut. I couldn't remember if I'd left it that way earlier. I stepped closer. My hand rested on the doorknob for a second. I almost walked away. Instead, I opened it. At first all I saw was darkness. Then 2 eyes. Someone was standing inside my closet. A man. He was so close that if I'd taken one more step forward, we would have been face to face. For a split second neither of us moved. Then survival instinct took over. I slammed the closet door shut and ran. I didn't stop to grab my wallet. I didn't stop to think. I sprinted out of the apartment, nearly tripping over myself in the hallway while dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, but I could barely get the words out. There's someone in my apartment. He's hiding in my closet. Within minutes, officers arrived. I stayed outside while they entered the apartment with their weapons drawn. Part of me expected the closet to be empty. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. But a few moments later they walked out with a man in handcuffs. He had never said a word. He never explained why he was there. The police questioned him for a long time, but as far as I know, they never got a clear answer. Even stranger, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. Nothing. The only explanation anyone could come up with was that I had accidentally left my apartment unlocked earlier that evening. To this day, I honestly don't know if that's true. Maybe I forgot. Maybe the lock hadn't latched properly, or maybe there's another explanation I'll never know. What haunts me the most isn't that someone broke into my apartment. It's knowing that while I sat on my couch watching a movie, a complete stranger was standing silently inside my closet, only a few feet away, listening to everything. When I was a kid, power outages were exciting. They meant candles, flashlights, and telling ghost stories until the lights came back on. That feeling completely disappeared one night. 3 years ago, I was living in a small rental house with a roommate. She had gone away for the weekend to visit her parents, leaving me alone. I'd worked an early shift that day and was exhausted by the time I got home. After eating dinner, I watched TV for a little while before heading upstairs around 10:30. I remember plugging my phone into the charger. It only had a couple of percent left, so I figured I'd let it charge overnight. Less than an hour later, I woke up. I don't know what woke me. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed my bedroom was completely dark, not the usual nighttime darkness. Pitch black. I reached over to check my phone, but the screen stayed black. The power was out. Normally, that wouldn't have bothered me. Storms happen. Power failures happen. I figured I'd head downstairs, grab a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and see if the rest of the neighborhood had lost electricity too. I stepped into the hallway. That's when something felt wrong. The house was too quiet. I stood there listening for almost a full minute. Nothing. I slowly made my way toward the stairs. Halfway down I heard it. A faint metallic click. It sounded like someone lightly tapping metal against metal. It came from somewhere downstairs. Every instinct told me to turn around. Instead, I kept moving. One careful step at a time. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I leaned around the corner toward the kitchen. The back door was still closed, but something immediately caught my attention. The curtain hanging over the small window in the door was moving. Not much, just enough to tell me there had been movement. Then I looked lower. My blood ran cold. The deadbolt was unlocked. I locked that door every single night, without exception. I didn't need to see anyone. I already knew. Someone was inside my house. I wasn't about to play the hero. The second my brain processed what I was seeing, I turned and ran. Barefoot. Straight through the living room, out the front door. I didn't even bother closing it behind me. I sprinted across my yard and pounded on my neighbor's door until they answered. Oddly enough, their lights were still on. Their electricity hadn't gone out. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a neighborhood blackout. Someone had cut the power to my house. The police arrived within minutes. While I waited next door, officers searched every room. Whoever had been inside was gone, but they found evidence. Outside, the main electrical cable had been deliberately cut. Inside, muddy footprints stretched from the kitchen into the hallway and toward the staircase. The intruder had been walking through my house, in complete darkness. The police couldn't explain why nothing had been stolen. Nothing was damaged. It was almost as if the person had entered for a reason completely different from robbery. That possibility terrified me even more. For months afterward, every little sound kept me awake. I installed brighter outdoor lights, bought security cameras, double-checked every lock before bed. Even then, I never felt completely comfortable, because the scariest part wasn't that someone had broken into my house. It was knowing they were inside, waiting in the dark, long before I realized I wasn't alone. I've heard people scream before. I've heard arguments outside my apartment, people yelling in parking lots, even the occasional fight after the bars closed. But nothing has ever sounded like what I heard that night. Even now, years later, I can still hear it if I think about it long enough. My girlfriend and I had been asleep for a few hours when I suddenly woke up. I glanced at the clock beside the bed. It was a little after 3 in the morning. At first, I couldn't figure out what had pulled me out of a deep sleep. Then I heard it again. A scream. Not the kind of scream you'd expect from someone being attacked. It wasn't a cry for help. It was louder than that, longer, raw. It sounded like pure rage. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, lingering just long enough to make every hair on my body stand up. I stayed perfectly still, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then it came again. Closer. Our bedroom overlooked the backyard, and beyond the fence there was nothing but a row of houses separated by wide lawns. The scream seemed to be moving. It wasn't staying in one place, it was getting closer. My girlfriend suddenly sat upright beside me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. Neither of us said another word, we simply listened. The screaming continued. Every few seconds it would stop, then start again. Each time it sounded nearer. I remember thinking there had to be someone running through the neighborhood. There was no other explanation, but something about the sound didn't seem human. It was too powerful, too controlled, almost theatrical, yet somehow completely genuine. Within less than a minute it sounded as though whoever or whatever was making that noise had reached the street behind the house. Then the next street. Then our street. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't stop imagining someone sprinting through the darkness, screaming at the top of their lungs for no reason. Then, silence. The screams stopped. Complete silence. Neither of us moved. The room suddenly felt much smaller. A few seconds passed. Then we heard footsteps, not on the sidewalk, not on the street, in the grass, right outside the bedroom window. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, deliberate. Someone was walking through the backyard. My girlfriend reached for my hand without saying a word. I squeezed it so tightly that later she joked I nearly broke her fingers. At the time, neither of us found anything funny. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the window. I held my breath. I was terrified that whoever was outside would suddenly knock on the glass, or worse, look inside. 5, maybe 10 seconds passed. It felt like an hour. Then the footsteps started again. They continued across the yard. A few moments later, the screaming returned. Only now it was moving away from the house, block by block, growing quieter until it disappeared into the distance. We stayed awake for another hour. Neither of us dared to look through the curtains. Neither of us wanted to know what had been standing outside that window. The next morning, I walked around the backyard expecting to find footprints. Nothing. No broken fence. No signs that anyone had been there at all. I asked a few neighbors over the following weeks if they'd heard anything strange that night. Some said they slept through it. Others said they thought they heard an animal. I spent hours online listening to recordings of foxes, bobcats, coyotes, even mountain lions. None of them sounded even remotely close. To this day, I have no idea what passed through our neighborhood that night. Maybe it was just a person. Maybe it wasn't. All I know is this: whatever stood outside our bedroom window, I'm grateful it kept walking. Most people assume that if someone knocks on your door, they're still standing there by the time you answer. Whoever was outside my house that night proved otherwise. I had been living alone in a small rental home for a little over a year. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, safe, and tucked away in a neighborhood where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. That was exactly why what happened felt so unsettling. It started around 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. I'd already brushed my teeth, turned off every light downstairs, and climbed into bed. I had just gotten comfortable when 3 slow knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. I sighed, assuming someone had the wrong address. After all, who visits someone that late without calling first? I walked downstairs, flipped on the porch light, and looked through the peephole. Nobody. I opened the door anyway. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. The street was completely silent. I stepped outside for a second, expecting to see someone walking away, but there wasn't a single person in sight. I shrugged it off as kids playing a prank and headed back upstairs. Less than 2 minutes later, the knocking returned, exactly the same. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not aggressive, just enough to make me stop in my tracks. This time I reacted immediately. I sprinted downstairs, hoping to catch whoever was doing it. I yanked the front door open. Nothing. Again, it didn't make any sense. Whoever was knocking would have had only a few seconds to disappear. There weren't any bushes nearby, no parked cars, no place to hide, still. No one. That was when the situation stopped feeling like a prank. I turned off the lights inside the house and stood beside the front window where I could see outside without being seen. For nearly 15 minutes I waited. No movement, no footsteps, not even a passing car. Eventually, exhaustion won. I locked the door one more time and went back upstairs. This time I managed to fall asleep, at least. For a while, a violent crash jolted me awake. Bang, another, bang. Someone was slamming both fists against my front door. The entire house seemed to shake with every impact. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:03 a.m. Whoever was outside wasn't knocking anymore. They were pounding on the door like they were trying to force it open. My heart was racing, but I forced myself downstairs. Halfway down the staircase, the pounding stopped. Instantly. The silence that followed was somehow even worse. I waited another few seconds before reaching the front window. I slowly pulled the curtain aside. No one. Again, the porch was empty. The street looked abandoned. I couldn't believe it. It was as if whoever had been outside knew exactly when I started walking downstairs. I stayed by the window much longer this time. Nearly a minute passed before I noticed headlights approaching. A dark-colored sedan rolled slowly down my street, painfully slowly. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't looking for an address. It simply crawled past my house before disappearing around the corner. I couldn't see the driver's face. The windows were too dark, but something about the timing felt impossible to ignore. Was that the person who had been pounding on my door? Were they watching the house from inside the car, or was it just an unfortunate coincidence? I never found out. The rest of the night passed without another sound. Days turned into weeks. Nothing else happened. No more knocks, no strange cars, no unexplained visitors. Life eventually returned to normal, but every now and then, usually around 10 at night, I'll hear someone knock on a neighbor's door, and for just a second, I'm right back in that house, waiting for another knock that no one will ever answer. People ask me all the time if I think those creepy clown sightings from years ago were real. After what happened to me, I don't laugh about them anymore. Back then, I was a freshman in high school, and one Friday night I had the entire house to myself. My older brother and sister were out with friends, and my parents had gone to dinner with theirs. It wasn't unusual. I actually enjoyed having the house all to myself. I spent most of the evening exactly the way any teenager would. Lights off, headphones on, playing video games in my bedroom. My room overlooked the backyard from the second floor, but I almost never paid attention to the view outside. It was just a fenced yard with a few trees and an old swing set we hadn't used in years. Around 9 o'clock, I leaned back in my chair during a loading screen and happened to glance out the window. At first, I thought someone had left a decoration in the yard. Something white stood near the center of the grass. I rolled my chair closer to the window. That's when it moved. It wasn't a decoration. It was a person, standing perfectly still, looking directly at me. Even from the second floor, I could clearly make out the mask. It was an old-fashioned clown face with exaggerated features and long strands of fake hair hanging from the sides. The clothes weren't anything unusual, just a hoodie and jeans. That somehow made it worse. There was no costume, no party, just an ordinary person wearing the most disturbing mask I'd ever seen. I grabbed my phone without taking my eyes off the window. My first thought was to call my parents. My second was to call the police. Instead, I crouched below the window and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was one of my friends trying to scare me. Maybe it was a prank. Slowly, I peeked over the windowsill again. The clown hadn't moved. He was still staring up at my bedroom. I suddenly remembered something else. My bedroom didn't have blinds anymore. A few months earlier, I'd accidentally broken them while tossing a basketball around inside. Whoever was standing outside could see everything. I switched off my bedroom light immediately. Then I hurried downstairs to make sure every door was locked. The front door, locked. Back door, locked. Every window I checked was secure. When I finally worked up the courage to return upstairs, the yard was empty. He was gone. Relief washed over me. I searched the backyard from every upstairs window. Nothing. Not a single sign that anyone had been there. A little while later, my family came home. I told them what I'd seen. My dad laughed. My mom figured it was probably some teenager pulling a prank. I tried convincing myself they were right. After midnight, everyone else had gone to bed. I stayed awake playing another game. Then I made the mistake of looking outside again. The clown was back, standing in almost the exact same place. Waiting. Watching. This time my bedroom was dark. There was no way he could see me, or so I thought. Then, he slowly lifted one hand and waved. Every muscle in my body locked up. He knew exactly where I was. I stumbled backward, grabbed the nearest blanket off my bed and covered the window. I didn't even stop there. I found a roll of tape in my desk drawer and taped the blanket over the entire frame. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want him seeing me. For the next hour I sat on my bedroom floor listening for any sound from outside. Nothing. Eventually curiosity got the better of me. I peeled back one corner of the blanket. The backyard was empty. No clown. No movement. Just darkness. I never saw him again. Years have passed since that night. People still joke about creepy clowns on the internet. Some think every story is fake. Maybe most of them are. But every time I look out a second-story window after dark, part of me still expects to see a figure standing silently in the yard, waiting for me to look back. Most people assume danger is easy to recognize. They picture someone wearing dark clothes, acting suspicious, or lurking in the shadows. The man I met looked nothing like that. He smiled. He was polite, and for the first 10 minutes we talked, I thought I'd met one of the friendliest people in town. It happened on a Saturday afternoon while I was waiting for my coffee at a small cafe a few blocks from my apartment. The place was crowded, so when the only empty seat happened to be across from another customer, I asked if he minded. "Not at all," he said with a smile. He looked to be in his late 40s, clean-cut, nicely dressed, the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about passing on the street. We started talking about completely ordinary things. The weather, the local baseball team, how impossible it had become to find decent parking downtown. Nothing unusual. Then, without thinking, I mentioned that I had recently moved into the area. He smiled again. "I know," I laughed. "You do. You're in the brick apartments near the park, aren't you?" For a second I assumed he had seen me around the neighborhood. "Yeah," I replied, "they're nice." He nodded. "They are, third floor if I remember correctly." My smile disappeared. I had never told him which building I lived in, or what floor. Trying not to sound nervous, I asked if we'd met before. He shook his head. "I've just seen you around." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. The conversation became awkward after that. I finished my coffee, wished him a good day, and left. I told myself I was overthinking everything. After all, maybe he really had seen me coming and going. Maybe he was a neighbor. That explanation lasted until Monday. I got home from work just after 6, and found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my car. There was no envelope. Just one sentence written in black ink. Asterisk, you should remember to lock your balcony door. Asterisk. I stared at the note for what felt like an hour. I hadn't told anyone about the balcony, and there was only one way to know I'd accidentally left it unlocked the night before. Someone had been watching my apartment. I reported the note to the building manager, who checked the security cameras covering the parking lot. The footage showed a man walking between the parked cars around 3 that morning. He stopped at my vehicle for only a few seconds before disappearing out of frame. The image wasn't clear enough to identify him, but I recognized the way he walked. Slow, relaxed, hands in his pockets. It was the same man from the cafe. The police took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. Leaving a note wasn't a crime. Watching someone wasn't enough to make an arrest. For the next few weeks, I noticed little things. A stranger standing across the street a little too long. A car that seemed to appear wherever I parked. Footsteps behind me that always disappeared when I turned around. Maybe it was all connected. Maybe none of it was. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I never saw the man again after I moved away. Sometimes I wonder if leaving was the reason he stopped. Other times, I wonder if he simply found someone else to watch. Either way, I still check my balcony door every single night, not because I'm afraid of forgetting, because I'll never forget the note that reminded me. Most people ignore calls from numbers they don't recognize. I wish I had done the same. This happened about 4 years ago, back when I had just moved into my first apartment after college. It wasn't much a one-bedroom place on the edge of town, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet sometimes. I worked late shifts, so it wasn't unusual for me to get home after 10 at night. My routine never really changed. I'd make something to eat, watch a little TV, and head to bed. One Tuesday evening, just as I was unlocking my apartment door, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. Hello. Silence, not complete silence though. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady. I waited a few more seconds before speaking again. Hello. The call ended. I shrugged it off and went inside. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown number. This time I let it ring. A minute later. Again, then again. 5 calls in less than 10 minutes. No voicemail, no text message, nothing. Eventually the calls stopped. I figured it was just spam. The next evening it happened again. Only this time, after I answered, a man's voice finally spoke. You got home later than usual. I froze. My apartment suddenly felt much smaller. What? I said. You got home later than usual. His voice was calm, almost friendly. Before I could respond, he hung up. I immediately walked to the window and looked outside. The parking lot was dimly lit. Only a handful of cars were parked there. I didn't see anyone. Still, I closed every blind in the apartment. The following night, my phone rang again. I didn't answer. A text message arrived a few seconds later. Asterisk, you should answer when I'm talking to you. Asterisk, I felt sick. I called the police. An officer came by, took a report, and advised me to keep the doors and windows locked. Without a warrant or an identifiable suspect, there wasn't much else they could do. The calls continued for almost a week, always around the same time, always from a blocked number. Then they suddenly stopped. I hoped whoever it was had finally given up. 2 weeks later, my apartment manager called. He asked if I had noticed anyone hanging around the property recently. Apparently, another tenant had reported a man sitting inside a parked car almost every night. When management reviewed the security cameras, they discovered the same vehicle had been entering the parking lot after dark for nearly 3 weeks. The driver never got out. He simply parked where he had a clear view of my building, sat there for an hour or two, then left. The license plate turned out to be stolen. The man was never identified. I moved a month later. Maybe it was an overreaction, maybe not. To this day, whenever my phone lights up with an unknown number, I don't answer, because sometimes the person on the other end already knows exactly where you are. People always say to trust your instincts. The problem is, sometimes your instincts don't start screaming until it's already too late. This happened a few years ago when I was still using dating apps. I'd gone on plenty of awkward first dates, but nothing that ever turned into a horror story. Until I met her, we agreed to meet at a small restaurant downtown on a Friday evening. She was funny, easy to talk to, and surprisingly down-to-earth. Within minutes, it felt like we'd known each other for years. Dinner lasted almost 2 hours. We laughed, shared stories from college, talked about work, family, and travel. Everything felt normal. When we finally walked outside, she smiled and apologized. I actually have to leave early morning tomorrow. No problem, I said. Before walking away, she scribbled her phone number on the back of my receipt. Text me. I watched her get into a dark SUV parked across the street. I didn't think much of it. The next afternoon, I sent her a message. Asterisk, hey, it's Ryan from dinner last night. Had a great time. Asterisk, the response came almost immediately. Asterisk wrong number. Asterisk I checked the receipt. I hadn't made a mistake. I tried calling. The number didn't exist. I figured she'd simply given me a fake number to avoid rejecting me face to face. It stung a little, but I let it go. A week later, something strange happened. I came home from work and found a small envelope tucked beneath my apartment door. There was no stamp, no address, just my first name written neatly across the front. Inside was a single photograph. It was me, leaving the restaurant after our date. The picture had clearly been taken from across the street. On the back, someone had written 5 words. Asterisk, you looked happier than usual. Asterisk, I felt my stomach tighten. Only 2 people knew I'd been there that night. Me and her. I contacted the restaurant, hoping their security cameras might show who had left the envelope. Unfortunately, the cameras only covered the entrance, nothing outside, nothing in the hallway of my apartment building either. For the next several days, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every stranger seemed suspicious. Every parked car felt out of place. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. No one spoke, but I recognized the breathing. Slow, patient, almost as if the caller was waiting for me to say something first. Instead, I stayed silent. Nearly 30 seconds passed, then a woman's voice whispered, "I knew you'd answer eventually." The line went dead. I changed my phone number the next morning. A few weeks later, I moved into a different apartment. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it wasn't. I never saw her again. I've often wondered whether the fake phone number was part of the plan from the beginning. Maybe she never intended for me to contact her. Maybe she already had another way of keeping track of me. Whatever the truth is, I've never accepted another handwritten phone number without wondering who really wrote it.